The United States tries to display leadership at the Summit of the Americas, but are countries in the region following Washington's lead? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The United States is hosting the Summit of the Americas for the first time since the very first one back in 1994. But this meeting has been marked by the countries that are not there. Mexican president and other leaders from the region decided not to show. It was a protest against the U.S. decision to not invite countries they deem authoritarian: Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. For more on the summit now, we turn to Edith Tiansen in Los Angeles. And Edith, what's the latest there?
And right now we're seeing basically the plenary sessions for the leaders in attendance. This is very much like the United Nations General Assembly, with each state leader or representative taking the podium one by one to talk about their country's respective concerns, priorities, and strategies moving forward. Earlier today, when we heard from the U.S. President Joe Biden, he painted a very optimistic picture for us, essentially talking about the enormous potential, he called it, for the Western Hemisphere. And he talked about how if all of the countries just came together with the right public-private engagement and the efficient use of resources, how this could essentially really be one of the most prosperous parts of the world. Now, many people were asking, obviously, when the U.S. is facing its own problems here at home economically, inflation. Abroad, he's been focused so much on Russia lately. Before that, it was all about the Middle East, Afghanistan. Many people are asking, does he really mean what he's saying? Earlier today, these are the comments he made.
And no matter what else is happening in the world, the Americas will always be the priority for the United States of America.
And of course, it's important because it comes at a time of several new partnerships being announced. We understand one is called the Americas Partnership. It comes with nearly $1.9 billion investment in mainly Central American countries. And really the ultimate goal there is to curb the record numbers of migrants coming from those countries. And the latest initiative that was announced has to do with a cooperation with the Caribbean nations to bolster their economies and convert it into green economies at the same time. We do expect more initiatives to be announced later on Friday, on the final day of the summit. Anand?
It is the Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. He was sitting on the fence about attending this summit, but he decided to come in the end. And that's after he was promised a bilateral meeting with Biden. So what can you tell us about the people who are there and those who are not?
I can tell you, whatever promises, commitments we are talking about, this issue, that the division within the summit has always been the sort of main subject we've been talking about since the beginning. And even now, just before this live hit, we were still hearing that issue being emphasized by some of the participants. But it does mean a lot. The fact that Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua were not invited, and as a result, countries like Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Bolivia did not send their state leaders. And on top of it, even those who still decided to come, countries like Argentina, Belize, are now talking about it, criticizing the U.S. government. In fact, Argentina just announced that in the future, no country should reserve that right to the invitation list, essentially. But the U.S. administration has been telling us all along that this doesn't take away from the potential of the summit, that all these countries are still at the table. But when asked earlier today, this is what the president of Mexico had to say about his absence.
It's a matter of interpretation. We are represented, but at the same time we do it under protest, because we do not accept anyone being excluded. We want the unity of all the countries of the American continent for the benefit of our peoples. And we don't want to encourage lockdowns or discrimination. We do not agree with maintaining the same interventionist policy as always.
The keyword interventionist seem to be the key there, because we're looking at a period where it's quite different from the time when the summit was first founded. The United States was really a regional leader that everybody looked up to. But decades later now, we're looking at a situation where so many of these countries have left-leaning governments. They feel they are sovereign to make their own decisions, and they do not necessarily agree with the United States when it comes to policy issues on several fronts. Anand?
Thanks, Edith. That's Edith Townsend reporting from Los Angeles. Now, to discuss relations between the United States and Latin America, let's bring in our panel. From Los Angeles, Gloria Lariva is coordinator of the Cuba and Venezuela Solidarity Committee. Gustavo Ribeiro is founder and editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. He joins us from Sao Paulo. Here in Washington, D.C., Artur Estopinen is the president of the Estopinen Group, a consulting firm. Also with us here in Washington, D.C., Rafael Bernal is a staff writer for the political publication The Hill. Welcome to all of you. Rafael, let me start with you. It seems the big news at the Summit of the Americas is about the countries that are not there. You know, as we just heard, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, not invited in protest. Mexico is not there, as well as a number of other countries, including Guatemala, Bolivia. And we just heard President Biden say there that no matter what happens in the world, the Americas will always remain a priority for the United States. Is that true?
Well, it's actually been a difficult relationship since the independence movements of the Americas, including the United States. And I suspect it will continue to be a difficult relationship. With Mexico particularly, Mexico's absence shows that Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the president, in the metaphor of carrot and stick diplomacy, he only responds to the stick. And I say that because he responded to President Trump he did everything President Trump asked him to when Trump was president. And now that Biden has tried to woo him with sort of diplomatic niceties, inviting his wife to the White House for Cinco de Mayo, inviting López Obrador to a Dodgers game in Los Angeles, trying to be openly friendly towards him, he's basically snubbed Biden at every chance he's gotten. And the absence, especially of Mexico and Honduras, can hurt the migratory accords that could be reached at this summit. But let's remember, this summit was never about big agreements. It's a little bit more about normalizing relations. And by setting a low bar, the Biden administration is probably going to avoid getting egg on its face.
So, Rafael, as you say, expectations are very low. So do you expect anything to come out of the summit?
Nothing substantial, really. The announcements that have come out, outside of that $1.9 billion that was mentioned in your report, that is very interesting. It's a good investment in Central America. Any investment is welcome, frankly, in that region, and it's well structured. Outside of that, you're going to get a lot of platitudes, a lot of good wishes, but there are a lot of lame duck presidents participating in this, and a lot of, Bolsonaro is basically a lame duck president at this point. Colombian President Duque is a lame duck president, is completely a lame duck president at this point. And López Obrador himself, although he's not there, he's getting into lame duck territory in the last 2 years of his 6-year cycle. So there's a lot, and Biden, of course, is up for re-election in 2024. So there's a lot that can't be achieved at this summit other than just normalizing relations and sort of calming the waters continent-wide.
Gloria, in his address on Wednesday, President Biden talked about democracy. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Our region is large and diverse. We don't always agree on everything. But because we're democracies, we work through our disagreements with mutual respect and dialogue.
So, Gloria, what do you make of the fact that there we have President Biden talking about resolving differences through dialogue, yet he's not prepared to talk to people, invite people with whom he has the biggest differences?
Yes, well, first I'd like to say thank you for the invitation. I'm here at the People's Summit for Democracy in Los Angeles, which is the counter to Biden's summit. And I'm here outdoor where you can see people outside. President Biden's absolute exclusion of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua is not only a slap in the face to those countries, but to every other country in the region, from Latin America and the Caribbean, who have insisted that all countries should be invited. It's an insult to all the leaders, and to expect that exclusion while they're meeting, it does not sit well with anybody. At the same time that talking about democracy, and in the United States, we're seeing some shocking developments domestically with the Supreme Court any day now about to rule what is expected to be an overturning of a woman's right to abortion on the national level. We're seeing the weakening of voting rights, something that was fought in the 1960s. And so it's not exactly a shining example for the rest of the region. Then you still have only 100 children who were separated out of the almost 2,000 from their parents, immigrant children. Over this last several years, only 100 have been reunited under Biden's administration. So there's a lot lacking. But I think calling it the summit of exclusion is the appropriate way to describe it.
Gustavo Ribeiro, the Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, of course, he was not invited to this summit, but he commented on the situation. Let's listen to what he had to say.
It's an error and an unacceptable snub, assuming that our people don't have memory. But it's even more important saying that the U.S. government lacks the moral authority to talk about democracy when it's not able to defend it and promote it in its territory and for its citizens.
So, Gustavo, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, shouldn't Cuba be at the table? And when you listen to what the Cuban leader had to say there, if you listen to the content and the tone of what he had to say, is it an indication that the United States no longer has the kind of influence that it used to have in Latin America?
Well, certainly the U.S. don't have the same influence they used to have, especially since China started to yield a huge economic influence in the region. But I would slightly disagree with Gloria when about the exclusion of these countries which are under authoritarian regimes, because Latin American countries in earlier this century have committed themselves to democracy. So I think is more nuanced when we talk about the exclusion of these countries, especially in the case of Nicaragua and Cuba, which are unquestionably authoritarian regimes.
Gloria, you want to respond to that?
Yes, I think that the issue of authoritarian, democracy, dictatorship, those notions should be just thrown out the window when you think about the right of the people in Cuba, for example, to housing, the right to live without fear of evictions while we're in the United States. The right of the landlord supersedes that of a tenant. In fact, there's no right of a tenant if you can't pay the rent. And so what is democracy? To me, democracy is the right of the vast majority of the people to live, to have health care. And Cuba has free health care. So the idea of dictatorship is three countries that have wrested themselves away from U.S. domination in taking back the resources of their country, but today are being not only excluded from the summit, they're being punished with sanctions and extremely severe blockade. The blockade of 60 years of Cuba, the robbing of Venezuela's oil, gold, and other resources, and Nicaragua suffering increasing sanctions. So, you know, I don't think that that sits very well with the peoples of the Americas, all the nations which have had one decade to another gunboat diplomacy, invasions, sanctions, blockade.
Otto Sturpinen, as we can hear, very diverse viewpoints on what is happening in Latin America right now. But what are your thoughts, rather, on the relevance of a meeting like this right now? And it comes at a time when, as our other guests have pointed out, the world is changing.
Yes, but the world is changing and should be changing for more democratic principles, not as my colleagues have delineated that communism is acceptable. Communism is acceptable, as my colleague in Los Angeles is saying, because she's a communist. and that's okay. And she believes in that political theory. But in the United States, you're able to say, I'm a communist and I am proud. In Cuba, in Venezuela, and Nicaragua, if you say, I am against those dictators, Ortega, Diaz-Canal, and Maduro, you are killed. And who's speaking for the 95% of the Cuban people, of the Venezuelan people, and of the Nicaraguan people? President Biden and this administration, by saying no to dictators. Those dictatorships in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua cannot be participating in this summit because they do not represent their countries. The only reason why they're in power is because they have guns and they kill their own people. That's why they're there. They don't represent their people, and President Biden is absolutely right. And I am a Republican. I'm a very conservative Republican, and I support him in this. And he's absolutely right in excluding them. And if President Lopez Obrador from Mexico wants to side with the murderous, oppressive dictators, then the Mexican people need to see that. And they're the ones who suffer from not participating in the summit that is sponsored by the #1 economy in the world.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Gloria, Arthur disagrees with what you had to say.
That Cuba, Nicaragua murder people. You know, if their voices of the leaders of those countries could participate, as many of the other countries in this Americas would support their being there. They don't support them because they support dictatorship. They support them because they know they have a voice and they have rights, and that the human rights of the people of those countries are respected.
Because of the guns.
I've been so many times.
The Cuban refugees prefer to be eaten by sharks in the Florida Straits than to stay in Cuba. The young people do not want any more communism in Cuba. In Venezuela and Nicaragua, they are murdered. They're killed. That is the reality, Gloria.
Okay.
And you could say that in the U.S. because you live in freedom. But you cannot say in Cuba, in Venezuela, Nicaragua, down with those refugees.
All right, Arthur, let Gloria get her word in, and I'm going to move on after that. Gloria, very quickly, please.
Well, people leave Cuba, people leave Mexico, people leave from all over the world to the U.S. because of the American dream of an economic betterment. It's economic. It's not political. Right. It's not repression. But I would dare say this. The U.S. had no problem with a fascist coup in Bolivia against Evo Morales. The U.S. was behind that coup. That is dictatorship would happen. Okay. And now the people voted back progressive government, and the same thing happened with Honduras. Under Obama, a coup was engineered. Yeah. And then as a result, tens of thousands of people have been murdered. All right. Now we have a progressive government re-elected.
Okay, I want to move on. Rafael, I want to get back to one of the big issues at this summit, and that is immigration. What can we expect on that?
Well, as of tomorrow, we'll get an agreement. We'll get the information on the deliverables that we can expect. But again, this returns to the issue of absences. The absence of every country from the Rio Grande to Costa Rica, from between those two spots, means that a big agreement, a presidential level agreement, cannot be reached. So we're not expecting a big deal here, and especially the absence of Mexico and Honduras. And frankly, I have to say on their absence, Cuba has always tried to take a disruptive stance in anything related to the Organization of American States and in most summits of the Americas, with two exceptions in the past. This case was not an exception, and frankly, the Cubans played their cards very well, and what the Biden administration didn't do that they should have done is they should have announced their decision on who was going to be invited, in this case, those who have signed and complied with the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and who was not going to be invited. By letting suspicions fester as to who they were going to be inviting, they ended up with this mess and so much focus on who's not here.
Gustavo, there was an interesting piece which was written by Michael Shifter, who's been on the show before. He's the former president of the Inter-American Dialogue, in which he says America's reputation has been eclipsed for the last 2 decades, largely because of the huge gap between Washington's claim to meaningful leadership and its simultaneous indifference towards the region. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I do, yes. There's a 2020 Gallup poll that shows that approval for U.S. leadership has waned globally, but especially in South America, countries like Chile or Argentina, even Brazil. And the pandemic is a good example. The first vaccines that arrived to Latin America were not from Europe, were not from the U.S., but rather from China and Russia. And these countries have yielded a lot of influence, especially in economic terms. The fact, for instance, Bolsonaro, the fact that he allowed himself to hint at a possible snub of this summit is telling that Latin American leaders are now changing the way they approach Washington and not automatically aligning themselves to Washington and feeling more free to a more independent position.
Arthur, what's your view on that? Does American policy towards Latin America need a major reworking in view of what I just read, that was written by Michael Shifter?
100%. Whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, those administrations have forgotten Latin America and have not realized the potential that Latin Americans represent vis-a-vis the U.S. economy. The population is young, they're energetic, they are computer savvy, but because of all the corruption, they have not been able to move forward. This summit should be about innovation, it should be about science, it should be about technology, engineering, mathematics, so that the young people can compete in a global economy. That's what this summit should be about. Not who cares if those dictators are not invited? Good, goodbye, period. Like Rafael said, that should have been clear from the very beginning and concentrate on substantive issues. And but you're absolutely right. And that gentleman was absolutely right. The United States has ignored Latin America. And like my other colleague said, they're looking for leadership in Asia and other places, because if the US is not going to provide the leadership that we should be providing, which is in our best benefit, Latin Americans are going to look for other leaders.
Gloria, on this question of leadership, there was an editorial in the Washington Post written by its editorial board. And the newspaper said that the lack of leadership is not Washington's fault. In fact, the newspaper puts the blame on Latin America. It says it's due to the fact that Latin America is coming apart because of populism and threats to democracy.
Well, I would like to say one thing that I want to come away with here, and that is that the last United Nations vote on the question of lifting the embargo, or as we call it, the blockade, of the United States against Cuba, 184 nations voted for Cuba, and only 2 voted against Cuba, the US and Israel. Denying food, medicine, blockading the country economically, sanctioning banks all over the world for daring to handle Cuba's transactions, which are needed for food and medicine, that's the greatest crime against humanity. Starving a people, or trying to, that's genocide by any definition. And that is what the U.S. is responsible for. The U.S. is using sanctions all over the world, and more against Latin American countries who don't do their bidding. Only a few years ago, John Bolton, under Trump, said the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well. And the people of this region, of this hemisphere, are shaking off that history and saying no more. We are sovereign, independent countries, and we want to be treated as such. That goes from the Arctic Circle to Tierra del Fuego.
Rafael, a former top advisor to Barack Obama when he was president, Dan Restrepo, he was in fact the point man for Obama on the Western Hemisphere, on Latin America. He wrote a piece in the Los Angeles Times in which he said, "We don't ever need a summit of the Americas again." He says that since its inception, the meeting failed to deliver, and it limits United States attention to this part of the world to just once every 3 years. Does he have a point there?
Well, I'm not going to question Dan Restrepo's expertise, which is ample and profound, but I feel that's a bit of a pessimistic view of what can be accomplished with Latin American unity and frankly, hemispheric unity, because there is a shared history, a shared post-colonial history, frankly, to all of the Americas, including Canada, the United States, and the Caribbean, which is often erroneously overlooked. But yes, this format, at least, it is certainly showing signs of age, and it was very effective in the 1990s with the politics of the 1990s. The politics have changed drastically in the last 30 years, and the new format has to be found at the very least.
Arthur, if we look at what the administration is trying to do, for instance, in Central America, it's proposed a $4 billion aid package for Central America, but that's been blocked by Congress right now. And, you know, Central American countries are often blamed for the drug crisis, but the United States has done very little to stop demand or bring down demand here in the United States. I mean, what will it take for that to change?
Well, the demand that our children are going through is the opioid, fentanyl crisis and drugs is just abhorrent. These young people are becoming more and more addicted, and we see more and more drugs coming through the border, the open border that this administration has. So the reality is that we need to work with those countries in Central America to improve and educate those populations so that they could compete in a global economy. I think that we will see a turnaround if we're able to help and work together with those countries to educate the young people. And also, we need more workers in the United States. And those people from Central America can be trained electricians, nurses, and others that Native Americans don't want to do those jobs. And that would help in the economy. So we need to do more to help, and we need to engage.
Okay, Gustavo, got about 40 seconds left. The Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, he's held a meeting, a bilateral meeting with President Biden on the sidelines of this summit. Why is that so important to the Brazilian leader? What does he hope to get out of it?
Well, the main goal for Bolsonaro is to have a photo op and show voters that will choose a new president in October, that he's not as isolated globally as he's being portrayed. But there's very little to expect from this meeting because, like Rafael said earlier, Bolsonaro is pretty much a lame duck president because all polls show that Lula is the heavy favorite in October, and Bolsonaro has been extremely disrespectful to Biden and has had very little incentive to wield anything, meet the U.S. halfway.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.